This is Cold Radio, the podcast of cases with no ending. Welcome back to Cold Radio. Today, we return to one of the cases that once shook America to its core, only to gradually fade into the shadows of silence for nearly 3 decades. The case of JonBenét Ramsey. And this year, right around the 28th anniversary of the day, the little girl was found dead in the basement of her own home. The Boulder Police Department released their annual investigation update. But this time, what made the update notable wasn't that it contained any new leads. It was that nothing had changed. The same familiar phrases repeated like an old recording. We are still working. We will not stop. This case remains a top priority. Statements full of emotion, from the heart, as they claim, but also full of voids, from the truth. And what's beginning to unsettle people is that those repeated words have now become proof of stagnation. No longer a commitment, but a reminder that for nearly 30 years, all efforts have stood still. In the new press release, Police Chief Steve Redfern wrote, "The killing of JonBenét was an unspeakable crime, and this tragedy has never left our hearts." A deeply emotional statement, but is it enough to soothe anyone? Because the death of a 6-year-old doesn't need sympathy. It needs truth and justice. The bigger and more painful question is this. If this case is truly a top priority, as they say, why has the public not seen a single concrete step forward in all these years? This isn't the first time Boulder PD has spoken up. They've released similar updates in previous years. But this time, there's a slight difference. They released it earlier than usual, not waiting for December. Why? They said it was because public pressure is increasing, and that statement, unintentionally, reveals what many longtime followers of the case have suspected. Without pressure, everything would likely remain still, hidden in the dark. Even stranger was the next line. The assertion that there is viable evidence and leads we are not pursuing, including DNA testing, is completely false. A clear response aimed at criticism. It seems someone, or some group, has forced the Boulder police to speak up, to push back, to defend their investigation. But when an investigative body feels compelled to explain that they're still working, could it mean that public trust has eroded so much that mere words are now needed to reassure? At this point, we have to ask ourselves, does an update like this truly serve as a progress report, or is it just a way to soften the rising tide of doubt? And the irony is, the nearly 3 decades of silence, with no indictments, no arrests, no new forensic results, have made each police statement more suspect than reassuring. I still remember a viewer once commented on this channel, "The longer they delay, the quieter the truth becomes, and silence protects the guilty." I don't know if that person is entirely right, but I do know this. Some truths don't die with time. They die when people stop asking. An update without progress becomes nothing more than a memo of delay. And in the case of JonBenét, we've had far too many of those. They say justice is a process, but it's also like a child waiting at the school gate for their father. If no one comes for too long, the child will understand. It's not because he's busy. It's because he chose not to come back. For JonBenét, it's been 28 years. No one has been charged. No one has taken responsibility. No confession. No justice. Only cold press releases written in warm language, as if trying to comfort a memory instead of returning the truth. Maybe it's time to stop asking, what are they doing? And start asking, what do they really want to find? And perhaps that question is the key that opens the next chapter. In the most recent investigation update, the Boulder Police Department emphasized one thing they consider a testament to nearly 3 decades of tireless effort. A number, 21,016. That is the number of tips, letters, emails, and pieces of information they say have been received and followed up on since JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her home. It's no small figure. Tens of thousands of leads, thousands of stories, Over 1,000 people interviewed, police traveled across 19 states, numerous investigators, case files, trips, and transcripts. But the results? Not a single indictment has been issued, no one has been charged, no confession, no answers. And when we look at the number 21,016, perhaps the first thing we should do is not praise it, but ask how many of those leads were truly pursued to the end. The truth is, the bigger the number, the easier it is for people to mistake it for progress. But anyone involved in investigations knows this: quantity does not equal quality. And in a case as complex, divisive, and full of suspicion as JonBenét's, thoroughly following every tip is nearly impossible, unless there's a true will to go all the way. We must ask a possibility, however negative it may sound. How many of those leads were just administrative motions? How many were brushed off? How many involved important individuals, but were dismissed for lack of solid evidence? I'm not the only one who has asked this question. For nearly 30 years, those following the case, independent investigators, journalists, documentary producers, have raised countless doubts. Take Burke Ramsey, for example, the boy who was only 9 years old at the time and was in the house the night the incident happened. Some of his behavior, like his strange smile during interviews or odd remarks about secrets, once shocked the public. But the focus isn't on the behavior, it's on the way the authorities responded. Burke's statements, the opportunities for follow-up questioning, any chance to clarify, almost entirely ceased after 1998. The Ramsey family quickly hired attorneys, refused direct cooperation, and since then, any discussion around Burke has been placed off limits. Another example, Linda Hoffman Pugh, the housekeeper, openly told investigators that she suspected Patsy, the mother of JonBenét, was the one who wrote the ransom note. She said Patsy had gotten angry when JonBenét soiled the bedsheets and had expressed frustration that JonBenét wasn't as perfect as she wanted. Linda was called in for questioning, but not to be treated as a witness. She later said it felt like they were trying to force her to confess. After that, she disappeared from the investigation. 21,016 leads, so why weren't the most important ones ever fully pursued? And then, there's the nearly 3-page ransom note, something any criminal expert would consider highly unusual. A kidnapper would never have the time to write such a long-winded letter right at the scene. And its content was filled with strange references, even including the phrase, "Don't try to grow a brain," almost as if quoted from an action movie. The note was written using pen and paper found inside the house. The handwriting looked deliberately distorted, making it hard to trace, and there was even a draft version that was started and then discarded. The rough draft still exists. No one has ever been arrested over this letter, and no official handwriting analysis has been publicly released. And if one of those 21,016 leads includes handwriting from someone in the house, why hasn't the investigation moved forward? We don't need to be experts to recognize a pattern in how this case was handled. Leads pointing away from the family were pursued, but leads pointing toward those inside the house were forgotten. The Boulder police once said, "Every lead matters." But if that's true, why haven't the people who worked inside that house, who cared for JonBenét, who might have heard something that night, ever been publicly called to testify? And there's something even more disturbing. When an investigative agency boasts about reviewing tens of thousands of leads, but the outcome remains zero, that is not proof of effort. It is proof of hopelessness. I don't deny that there may be officers who are truly dedicated, who genuinely want to solve this case. But the problem lies with the system, a system that won't let them go beyond what is allowed, a system that, from the start, set limits on the truth. And now, as another update is released with the usual claim, "We are still investigating," I just want to ask, investigating until when? How many more leads will be enough? JonBenét has been gone for nearly 30 years. She never had the chance to grow up, to speak her truth. All we have left to rely on is one thing, the voice of truth. But if that voice is lost in 21,000 fragmented pieces of doubt, who still has the strength to piece it all back together? Maybe what we need now isn't more information, it's courage to face what's already there. what we've long tried to avoid. When you hear the phrase cold case review panel, what's the first image that comes to mind? For most people, it's a group of seasoned experts sitting down together to carefully re-examine a case long believed to be forgotten. An independent, objective effort, not meant to protect anyone, not meant to appease the public, but with only one goal: to uncover the truth. But when that phrase appeared in the latest investigation update from the Boulder Police Department, along with the statement that it is Boulder PD, not the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, leading the panel, all faith was instantly put to the test. Because if the review panel for the JonBenét case is being run by the very agency that led the original investigation, and also the agency most criticized for poor handling, lack of transparency, even possible bias, then can we still believe that this review is fair? There's no list of members, no progress reports, no disclosure of their working methods or what criteria they're using to reevaluate the evidence. All the public has received is a name, a signboard that says, "We're still working." But is that really an investigation? Or is it just another form of self-censorship? What makes the JonBenét case so different isn't just that the victim was a beautiful 6-year-old girl once famous in the media. It's that, from the beginning, the case was in the hands of an investigative body that many believe had ties that were too close to the victim's family. The Christmas parties in Boulder, the social circles of donors, business people, and local authorities, all of it chipped away at public trust in the independence of the investigation. And when that very same agency, Boulder PD, is once again taking the lead in reviewing the case nearly 30 years later, the question becomes, are they truly willing to admit their own mistakes? Have you ever seen someone investigate themselves and publicly admit that they failed? In any legal system, the principle of checks and balances is fundamental. Investigations must be supervised by an external party. Judgments must come from someone with no vested interest. But in this case, the cold case review panel is being run by people deeply connected to the case itself. That's what has led many observers, even those who once trusted the system, to begin doubting. Was this panel really created to uncover the truth or to protect a conclusion already chosen? And if that's the case, then what are we really witnessing? A version of justice designed by those who once controlled it, not to discover but to manage the flow of information, to ensure no one digs deeper than what's allowed. For years, the Ramsey family, especially John, has repeatedly called for a fully independent investigation team, even offering to fund modern DNA testing by private labs. But there's been no concrete response from Boulder PD, only the usual lines. We're working with experts. We're still investigating. You might ask, if the father himself wants a third party involved, why would the police refuse? But once you understand that any new information, if not tightly controlled, could severely damage the reputation and accountability of those central to the original case, you begin to see why this panel remains internal. In fact, in a system that values justice, independence is not a luxury, it's a requirement. And in a case as controversial as JonBenét's, there's a greater need than ever for an investigative force from outside of Boulder. Do you remember the Golden State Killer case? A serial murderer who terrorized California for decades. That man, a former police officer, was eventually tracked down and arrested thanks to help from independent scientists, genealogical DNA databases, and private labs like Othram. But in the JonBenét case, all calls to bring in these kinds of organizations have been ignored. Perhaps because, unlike other cases, where the victim has no link to the authorities, this case is too deeply intertwined with those who once ran the show. And here's something worth remembering. Justice cannot exist on promises alone. It must be protected by transparency, oversight, and the courage to admit that mistakes were made. But the latest update, and the insistence that the review panel belongs to Boulder PD, makes any hope for a true turning point feel increasingly fragile. Because when the people leading the investigation are also the ones reviewing it, can we really expect the conclusion to change? I still believe there are people who genuinely want to take this case to the end. Maybe a scientist in a lab, an independent investigator, or maybe someone listening to this podcast right now, because sometimes a small light from outside the system can reveal an entire room long buried in dust. And if this cold case review panel truly wants to reopen the case, the first thing they need to do isn't to hold private meetings, but to go public. Who is on the panel? What is the timeline? Are they open to independent DNA testing? What have they re-examined? What have they dismissed? And why? If they can't answer those questions, then don't call it a review panel. Call it what it really is, a curtain drawn between the public and the truth. If you also feel that something isn't right, don't stay silent. One comment from you might be what keeps the truth from being forgotten. I'd love to hear your thoughts before we continue this story. For nearly 3 decades, whenever someone asked about the progress of the JonBenét Ramsey investigation, the answer has always pointed back to one thing: DNA. The touch DNA found on JonBenét's underwear was once considered the only hope for justice. It did not match any member of the family. And, based on that, in 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey officially cleared the Ramsey family of all suspicion. She said, and I quote, "DNA doesn't lie." But what no one was willing to say at the time is that DNA doesn't tell the whole story either. And to this day, in 2025, the narrative around DNA in the JonBenét case continues to be treated as something unquestionable, as if it were absolute truth, untouchable, beyond doubt. In the most recent update, the Boulder Police Department emphasized, "We are continuing to use state-of-the-art DNA technology." They said they are working with leading experts and that no evidence or lead has been overlooked. But they didn't clarify. What DNA samples are they analyzing? What technology is being used? Have they invited independent organizations like Othram or Parabon? All we're given is a vague, abstract promise that DNA remains the focus. And if you've followed this case long enough, you'll notice one thing. The more they talk about DNA, the more they avoid everything else. No one talks about the 3-page ransom note anymore. No one mentions the flashlight. No one explains the white cord. And no one answers the question. If there were no signs of forced entry, how did the killer get in? They just talk about DNA. And so, the DNA sample becomes the perfect shield. A scientific tool, neutral and emotionless, but now used as a door to close off all further questioning. Touch DNA is an extremely sensitive form of evidence. It can come from a simple touch, a piece of dead skin, a pat on the back, or even from a factory worker during the manufacturing process. Famed forensic expert Dr. Henry Lee once warned, "The absence of DNA is not the absence of guilt." And conversely, the presence of DNA doesn't always mean guilt either. In other words, the presence of DNA is not enough to determine guilt, and the absence of DNA is not enough to prove innocence. So why, since 2008, have all relevant agencies, especially the Boulder District Attorney's Office, treated this single DNA sample as the most decisive piece of evidence? Perhaps because it's easy to use. It doesn't require reinvestigating. No need for cross-examinations. No need to revisit the crime scene. No need to clarify old doubts. Just say, "This DNA doesn't match the family." And that's it. But if justice truly relied on DNA, then why do so many other cold cases continue to be investigated, even without clear biological evidence? The Golden State Killer, a serial murderer who evaded capture for over 40 years, wasn't caught through touch DNA. He was identified through genetic genealogy, a new technology that allows investigators to match DNA with distant relatives in public databases, eventually leading to a suspect. That technology is becoming more and more common. Many states are using it to solve long-standing cases. But what about Boulder? John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, has publicly called for this technology to be used. He even offered to work with private labs like Othram, which has solved hundreds of cold cases through genealogical DNA. And Boulder's response? Silence, no approval, no rejection, just silence. Perhaps because if they use new technology, the results might lead them somewhere they don't want to go. Personally, I don't believe in a grand conspiracy, but I do believe in the fear within the system. Because if genealogical DNA points to a new name, and that person is linked to someone who was once a suspect, once cleared, then everything established over the last 20 years would have to be rewritten, and not everyone is willing to face that. Sometimes it's easier to stick with the old conclusion than to open a new door. We have the right to ask, if they are truly using modern DNA technology, then why not announce it? Why not be transparent with the public? Why not invite independent labs? If you're doing the right thing, you have nothing to hide. The truth is, DNA has been turned into a symbol, a word repeated in every update. But when you look closer, you'll see. It's no longer a tool to find the killer. It's becoming an excuse not to look at the darker truths. A strange ransom note, a staged crime scene, a mysterious family, a boy with a smile no one could forget, a silence that never ends. And that's why, perhaps, the scariest question is no longer, does DNA lie? But rather, who is using DNA to lie for them? There's something strange that happens in cases that stretch on for too long. Truth stops being something people wait for and becomes something they're afraid to face. When JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in the basement on the morning of December 26, 1996, all eyes turned to Boulder, Colorado. That 6-year-old girl, once radiant on beauty pageant stages, now lay cold in the family's luxurious home. From that very moment, the case became a tragedy, not just for one family, but for the entire country, because it raised a question that no one has been able or willing to answer definitively. If the truth isn't out there, but inside that house, what are we going to do with it? 28 years have passed, and through all those years, every time a new update came out, every time there was a promise of "we'll never forget," people began to realize something else. Justice is no longer what the system is pursuing. It has become something used to preserve public faith, whenever that faith starts to crack. In the most recent update, the Boulder Police Chief wrote, "We recognize how deeply this crime affected our community, and we remain committed." They commit, they express sympathy, they promise to keep going, but then they offer no concrete direction, no new names, no request for cooperation from outside labs, no appeal to the public for information, no clear plan. They simply say they are still working, and that's apparently enough to close out another year. But if justice really is a priority, why is everything still so quiet? I used to think the scariest thing in a criminal case was that the killer hadn't been caught. But with JonBenét, the more terrifying feeling is this. The case feels boxed in. No one says it's over, but everyone acts like it is. Not because no one cares, but because the more people care, the more cautious the system becomes. Cautious not to say the wrong thing. Cautious not to disrupt what they've been preserving for years. Stability. Have you noticed? Every time John Ramsey, the father, calls for justice, he no longer singles anyone out. He doesn't mention Mary Lacey by name. He doesn't explicitly criticize Boulder's investigation. He simply says, let an independent party take over. Because maybe he too understands the system no longer wants to change, and if justice is to come, it will not come from within. As for the mother, Patsy Ramsey, she died of cancer in 2006. She left this world never having been charged and never officially exonerated either. She left with a secret that perhaps only she truly knew. And Burke, the little boy from that night, is now a grown man. He no longer gives interviews, no longer appears in public. He lives quietly, privately, carrying with him a legacy that no one can wash away. The suspicious gaze of an entire generation. And then, there's the strangest part of all. JonBenét's death has created a strange kind of void, where everyone says they want the truth, but no one dares walk toward it. Maybe because walking toward it means touching things we don't want to face. A family that wasn't perfect. A justice system that once failed. A community that stayed silent when it should have spoken up. And maybe the most painful realization of all, If we truly go all the way to the end, the person responsible might no longer be alive to answer. Or worse, they might still be alive, but will never speak. Personally, I still believe in justice, but I no longer believe that the system will deliver it unless it's pushed. And that push won't come from a report, won't come from a DNA sample, won't come from a panel meeting. It will come from the people who still care. From you, the one listening to this podcast. From the one who commented, that letter couldn't have been written by a stranger. From the one who still remembers JonBenét's eyes on the cover of that old magazine. Because if we all stop asking, if we all accept that it's been too long, let it go, then JonBenét's death will no longer be a tragedy. It will become a precedent. A child can be murdered in her own home, and 30 years later, the only answer we're left with is silence. You see, in a world where everything can be measured, response times, case data, number of interviews, there is one thing that cannot be quantified: the truth. It's not in the numbers, not in the lists, not in the annual reports. It only comes when someone is brave enough to face what's uncomfortable, what's inconvenient, what might shatter the image we've tried to protect for far too long. Justice doesn't come by staying silent. It comes when someone finally dares to break that silence. And perhaps the last thing I want to ask, after all the analysis, the doubts, the questions, is this: did JonBenét die once? Or has she been killed again and again, each time the truth was ignored in the name of keeping the peace? The answer is not in the case update. It's in how you, I, and all of us choose to remember this case.